My name is Robert Boynton. I run the literary reportage program here at the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute at NYU. And I'm really glad to see such a big crowd for this fantastic event. We are here to talk about investigative journalism, long-form nonfiction, however you want to term it. And I want to introduce our discussants. Pam Colloff is a senior reporter at ProPublica and a staff writer at the New York Times Magazine. She was previously an executive editor and staff writer at the Texas Monthly, where she earned a 2012 National Magazine Award in feature writing. Janet Reitman is a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine. She is the author of Inside Scientology, which was based on her National Magazine Award-nominated story published in Rolling Stone, where she was a longtime contributing editor. She's now working on a book about extremism. Lizzie Presser, in the middle, covers health and healthcare policy at ProPublica. She was previously a contributing writer for the California Sunday Magazine, and she has twice been a finalist for the National Magazine Award and the Livingston Award. And we're here tonight to celebrate the publication of this book, New Stories We Tell, True Tales by America's New Generation of Great Women Journalists. The book is for sale by the table. I'm sure that even some of the authors will sign copies if you like. The book is published by Mike Sager, a veteran journalist. Mike Sager is a best-selling author and award-winning reporter. For more than 40 years, he's worked as a writer for the Washington Post, Rolling Stone, GQ, and Esquire. He's also the editor and publisher of the Sager Group, LLC, a consortium of multimedia artists and writers. And the editors of the collection, who I gather were the originators of the project, are Kaylin Ralph and Joanna Demkowitz. So I want to thank them, thank Mike for putting this all together. So we're going to have a discussion, and I'm going to play as small a role as possible in sparking the discussion. And at about probably about an hour into it, we'll start taking some questions, and I hope that the last hour will really be full of that. So I guess the question I wanted to start off with was, how do you find your subjects? How do you find your stories? Everyone has a sort of a method of some sort. What are yours? Share.
I always remember I should sit in the middle, so I'm not first. So for me, generally it's an issue that, well, I used to work at Rolling Stone for like 15 years. So for us there, certain stories would emerge that were like, this is obviously a Rolling Stone story. Like I did a piece about the Boston Marathon bomber, Jahar Tsarnaev. He was clearly a Rolling Stone story. Certain stories will just emerge, will just happen, and you're like, okay, this is clearly a story for us. But usually it's in general, it's, I pay attention to sort of social and cultural trends. I don't cover electoral politics, but I do I'm a political journalist. And so I pay attention to what's going on, and usually something in the general conversation is going to interest me, and then I'll sort of be like, okay, I'm writing for the past, I've covered terrorism for a long time, and both Islamic and white supremacist terrorism, and I thought that this was a very pressing issue for our country, and it's a very important conversation. I mean, I'm actually somebody who will take a contrarian view about terrorism, but I felt very strongly that there was a rhetorical, there was sort of a rhetoric around terrorism that was overblown, and that I wanted to explore. And so I have sought for the past like 7 or 8 years to find stories within that larger issue that are, kind of speak to that in one way or another. So it's the Boston bomber, it's kids who wanted to join the Islamic State, it's young men who are neo-Nazis. It's kind of like they're all kind of connected to a certain type of issue that I find interesting. And it's a self-defined beat. I mean, in lots of ways, it's a beat.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like being a newspaper reporter, but magazine writers are often generalists, but you do kind of at a certain point define what you're particularly good at. And somebody will think of a story, oh, that's a Pam Colloff story, or that's a Janet Reitman story, or Lizzie Presser story, or something, and so I think it's a very organic process in lots of ways. Okay, that's my answer. That's it.
I definitely am a generalist. For the first time I have a beat, but that's unusual for me. And I think, as I was thinking about this question, or I've been asked this question multiple times, I generally come to stories just because I have a question about something and I want to understand the answer to it. So, like the first magazine story I did, I had a friend in Thailand who told me that she was going to spend $4,000 to buy herself a job on a cruise ship. And I was like, that sounds like a very, very bad situation. And so I just started reading a bunch of chat forums about it and reaching out to lawyers until I realized that it indeed was an awful situation and way worse than she had thought it was initially, and that was my first large investigative story. Sometimes it's a statistic. Like I read a statistic that African Americans only make up 1% of America's farmers. And I'm like, how is that even possible? Like what has happened in the last 100 years that we landed at that statistic? And I dug into a lot of the academic literature and wrote a story about heirs property, which is like a form of land ownership that's very easy to take. So it's a mystery to me sometimes how I find stories, except for to say that I am often trying to feed my own curiosity. And that's generally is what drives me towards the stories that I'm going to do my best work on.
I think my answer echoes both of yours, but I'm a generalist who became a beat reporter, and I do criminal justice stories now. And for the past few years, I've been trying to tell stories sort of each year looking at a different cause of wrongful convictions, but I don't spell that out. I'm always looking for a story that's going to captivate you, and you might not care about criminal justice reform, but hopefully you'll get caught up in that story. And I can know that a topic is interesting, like prosecutorial misconduct, which doesn't sound very exciting, but it's not until I find that particular case that really sings to me that I know that's my story. And so a story that I did 2 years ago for the Times Magazine and ProPublica, which was about bad forensic analysis. I looked at something called bloodstain pattern analysis, which if I told you that I wrote a 22,000 word story about bloodstain pattern analysis, you might pass. But in Texas, where I'm based, we have something called the Texas Forensic Science Commission, and that is where lawyers and defendants can take complaints about how they may have been convicted with faulty forensic testimony. And so I just started going through that and looking at complaints about bloodstain pattern analysis, and came across this amazing case of this beloved high school principal who'd been convicted of murdering his wife even though he was not in the same town on the night of the murder. And that became this very, very long story. So I do think there's a little bit of magic and luck too, and sometimes it's talking to someone randomly in your Uber or wherever that an idea starts to come to the surface. For me, I talk to a lot of lawyers all day long, and I read a lot of legal documents to try to find the stuff that doesn't sound as boring as that. So.
And when you're reading these legal documents, or when you, Lizzie, are just looking at other sorts of statistics, or when you're looking at the sort of the landscape of terrorism, as we have so many different varieties these days, what kind of characters are you looking for? What kind of people are you looking for? Is the character the thing that draws you in, or is it the idea and then you find the character? I
like writing about. I tend to to like writing about young people. Again, because I was a Rolling Stone writer for so many years, that was sort of a part of our brief. But I also think that there's something about young people, like, and I'm talking about anybody under the age of 30, basically, who are very idealistic, and they don't always have, especially teenagers, they don't have great impulse control, so they sometimes will find their idealism leading them into places that are really politically dicey, and they find themselves in the middle of tremendous political stories, actually. And so they become like this kernel of like, they're like this magnetic kernel that you can write an entire story around, because they're almost, I mean, it's not that a teenager is all that interesting, it's that necessarily, some of them are, and a lot of them are not. It's just that, you know, the unbelievable situation that a 17-year-old might find themselves in if they try to go and, you know, join the Islamic State, or, you know, get involved in some neo-Nazi group, and the next thing you know, they're training with guns somewhere. Like, it tends to raise almost every possible issue around what's so crazy about this, particularly law enforcement, that when law enforcement gets involved in these cases and they start to try to arrest a 15-year-old, it really crystallizes for you what's so screwed up with our, you know, the way our law enforcement system, and the way we view, and the judicial system, and the way we view this issue. So I think, like, I tend to like kids, but it's not exclusive, and I think that, but I definitely like a character. I mean, I tend to look for, I tend to look for a person, I think. I can't just write a story about, I can't not write about a person. I think it's too difficult to just kind of, you know, do it like a sort of backwards way. It doesn't work.
Yeah, I'm always drawn into a story from a structural problem that I see. So I start with that idea, and then I do something kind of crazy, very typically, which is I go on long scouting trips, essentially, where I know very little, and I try to meet as many people as possible, and I see who I connect with, and like where I feel like I can write the most powerful story from. Which is a bizarre experience, because sometimes it feels like you're auditioning people to play the part of the central character.
Well, you are.
And you are. And you are. But it also is part of the reporting, because you're learning, you know, where there are similarities. So if I generally write about the experiences of, like, how people experience social policy or gaps in social policy. And so that's all really important pre-reporting for me as well, right? I get to see where their similarities are and the kinds of threads that I want to pull out. So I do that, and I want to kind of fall in love with the character in a way, to feel connected to them in some way, because then I'm gonna be able to draw them out more if there is that connection. So it's either that, or I need to know that the people around them are people who I can talk to and who can draw them out as well. So I've had characters who are really terrible at reflecting on themselves, but their wife is incredible. And she'll like give me all the juiciest details, and then I can go back to him and get it all out of him too, you know?
But can I ask you a question of this?
Course,
Because this idea of scouting is fantastic. Who's paying for that? Is that ProPublica?
I've been so lucky. So
That's
now
great.
it's ProPublica. Before, every investigative story I had funded from a nonprofit organization, which is now called Type Investigations, previously called the Investigative Fund. And so they would pay for that. I would definitely have to ask.
Yeah, I mean, I've gone on scouting trips too. It
pays off.
It pays off. It pays off. It's totally worth it. It's worth it, even if you have to do it yourself. I think it's worth it.
Yeah.
I think you can do a lot by phone, as far as sort of.
Yes.
I used to think I had to do everything in person, and it is amazing what you can get by phone. I was just going to say, falling in love with the character, I think, is so much a part of the process. And the way I describe it is that I like to write stories about ordinary people in extraordinary situations.
Yes.
And trying to find, there are many people you could describe that way, but you have to try to find someone who can tell you the information. I've passed on stories that were incredible stories, but the person couldn't narrate, or the person around them couldn't narrate. And then maybe less extraordinary stories where the person's recall was just, you know, novelistic. And I always think of it, I did an oral history many years ago called 96 Minutes, which was about the UT Tower shooting in Austin. And it's told through the voices of survivors who at the time were told to keep quiet about what happened, and this was not something that was talked about and to brush it under the rug. So many of these people were telling me these stories for the first time. The shooting happened on campus very close to the English department. So the first people I started talking to were the English majors, who would say things like, it was a deep blue sky, and the sun was shining. The mamas and the papas were on the radio when the ricocheting sounds of the, and I was like, this story is going to be incredible. And then I didn't do this on purpose. This was just who was closest and who wasn't. And it literally, the last people I interviewed were the engineering students who said things like, it was a very sad day. And so if you have, the engineering student type of person you're trying to write about, you're going to have to find a lot of strategies to make that work. And sometimes they're not there. So I'm always trying to find the English student, so to speak.
Well, if you can't find the English student, if there are only engineering students, or if there are, mute, inarticulate adolescents, I have one, so
yeah.
I can say that.
Very difficult.
How do you get your subjects, your characters, to talk to you?
Sometimes they don't. To be honest, sometimes they don't, and you have to talk to everyone around them. I'm writing a book, and I just did a tremendously long chapter about somebody who was refusing to talk to me. So I've interviewed a lot of people around him, and I happen to understand certain aspects of his experience because it pertains to. He was a soldier in Iraq, and I understand certain aspects of what he went through, and in that case, you have to dig deep into your experience and your bravery and creative spirit, and channel somehow who these people are without actually interviewing them. And not everybody, yes, it's great if you have somebody who does that, but I've some of the characters that I've written about, have taken me months and months and months and months and months to reach. Oftentimes I work with their lawyers, and it's interesting because in this book, in the story that's in this book about these kids that wanted to join the Islamic State, this was all driven by the teenage. The main story was about a boy, a teenage, 18, 19-year-old who was arrested because he wanted to be an ISIS fighter. In reality, it was his sister, who was 17, who wanted to go and be an ISIS bride because she had been a shut-in and was a very, very religious Muslim who for whatever the reasons, she didn't want to go to school. She wanted to be homeschooled, and she was had no social life at all. And so she began to go online and meet people, and the relationships that she would form with boys were safe because they were on the internet, so she didn't have to be covered, and she didn't have to necessarily watch what she said. It was fascinating. And she wanted to go and live this exciting life. And so when I understood that this was a fantasy of a 16-year-old, 17-year-old teenage girl who had almost like an Aladdin fantasy, like this, that she was going to go and live in the magical land of Sham, that's what we called it. I worked very, very closely with her lawyer and wound up ultimately getting to sit down with her in her home. As a woman, I could do that, and she didn't have to be covered. And we talked about makeup. And, she happened to be really into makeup, YouTube videos about makeup. And so we wound up talking about girly things. And that then, now she texts me all the time and tells me her political perspectives and, what she wants. She's really interesting. But I tend to try to, especially with people that are not articulate, I try to find some common bond with them that we can discuss, and it may have nothing to do. Oftentimes, I learned this very early in my career from a photojournalist named Eugene Richards, who I was working on a story with, and it was in the Deep South, and he went into this home, and he didn't even have his cameras with him. He spent 3 days just talking to these people without taking a picture, and I was like, wow. and he was like, this is how you gain people's trust. This is how people will reveal themselves if you don't come at them with your notebook or come at them with your recorder. So a lot of times I will sit down and just chat with people about their lives, about whatever, about, whatever that thing is that seems to be interesting, most interesting to them that I could connect to and get them to trust me that way. And then at a certain point, they will begin to open up about the actual story. That's kind of how I do it.
I was just going to say, since you mentioned texts, I am obsessed with finding each person's preferred method of communication, because I've found that there are people who are very, very quiet in person, who are big texters, or they're really into Facebook Messenger, or they're really into DMs, or whatever it may be. And if you can crack that code, I have sources, this is both good and bad, who text me at all hours of the day and night with
me too.
all sorts of information and insights that if I get them on the phone, maybe I don't get. So that's been something I've been thinking about a lot recently.
This girl that I was just mentioning, I don't talk to her on the phone. I only text with her, and that's it. That's how she wants to communicate. I don't know if she would, I'd like to go and meet her, hang out with her in person, but she's in Chicago. It's only text, and all hours of the day and night. And you have to answer, by the way, when they do that. You can't just blow them off. You have to actually engage, so it can be tiring.
I often find that it takes a really different style with different people. So I have had experiences where I worked on one story with kids, and I didn't take out my notebook for a few days because I really did want them to feel comfortable and to understand who I was and what I was doing, but also to know that they could say no to me and we could have a rapport, and that really paid off. The last story I wrote, one of the main characters was a debt collector, and I did want to come at him really early. Like, I wanted to be very honest about what I was doing, and that also paid off. So I feel like there's often this game for me where I have to make this calculus of like, what is my approach and why, and I'm trying to read other people as I do that. But no matter what, the main thing that is important to me is that I just stick around for a really long time.
Yeah, that's the key.
That's the key.
The key is to stick around. Don't leave.
Do not leave.
Do not leave.
And I become
even though you really want to.
Yes, especially when you really want to. And I think that persistence pays off. People see it. They know that you're dedicated to it. Yeah.
That's the thing, too. Like, I don't know if you've heard, I'm sure you have, one of the most common sort of comments that I get from sources or lawyers, especially from lawyers, when they decide to work with me, it's always because because you stick around. You're not going to rush to judgment. Like, it's a really... People who want to grant you access, they get that. They appreciate that. That really conveys something to them, like a level of commitment that it's always astonished me that somebody wouldn't have that level of commitment. But apparently a lot of journalists do not have that level of commitment. So if you, as a magazine journalist or somebody who writes long stories, you have to have that level of commitment.
I think some of it also comes down to time and resources, and
yes,
the three of us have been very, very fortunate in that way. I was listening to an interview with Eli Saslow at the Washington Post about how he embeds with families for months at a time, like months and months, and he's there when they get up in the morning and when they go to bed at night, and the idea is to sort of fade into the background, and he does incredible work.
Yeah, he does.
But when I was listening to it, I thought that takes a lot of money, and that takes a very particular publication to allow you to do that. And of course, I would love the interview about times he's done that when there's no story at the end, which I'm sure has happened.
Right.
And we've all been there. But in whatever way you can, maybe it's not always in person, maybe it's texting, maybe it's a long phone call in between visits. Keeping that communication and trust open is really important. And I always tell people, and I say it in a funny way, but when someone agrees to do this with me, and I try to explain what that experience is going to be like, I always say, you're going to get really sick of me. And I say it as a joke, but I want them to know up front. I don't want them midway to be like, why are you still here? You know, I want them to know I'm going to be spending a lot of time talking with you and being in your life. And so if that's a problem, let's talk about it now.
But what you're really describing, though, I mean, you said explicitly you want to fall in love with a character. You talk about being in the characters' lives in this sort of non-transactional way, right? Not taking notes. I mean, to my mind, a non-transactional relationship is called a friendship. So how do you navigate this gray area of being friends with the people you're reporting on?
I don't really have a problem, to be honest with you, to be friendly. You know, as long as they understand that at the end of the day, I'm a journalist, I'm going to report, I'm going to tell a story about their lives, and it's going to be honest. And that, you know, if they trust me enough to reveal themselves to me, that, you know, they won't always like what nobody wants to read about them. So one of the things I always tell people is I would not want to talk to me. I understand your reticence. Like, it's difficult to talk to a reporter and to think that you're revealing yourself. I kind of also believe that the smart people understand that if they do talk to you, they have some control, because it is a relationship where you can't help but begin to, you know, to some degree or another favor your character. But this is subjective. This is a subjective bit. This is not objective. This isn't like breaking news journalism. This isn't, you know, this isn't 400 words. This is long, long stories. And it deals, you know, magazine writing is about analysis. It's about deep, deep reporting. It's about deep, deep thinking. And that is a subjective process. So I don't have a problem with befriending to some degree or another the people I'm writing about, because it's just part of that. How can you ever analyze something or devote yourself to it in a way without having some kind of personal feeling towards these people? I think it's if you have no personal connection towards your characters, I think it's really, really hard to write about them in a compelling way. So, but the short answer is I don't have a big problem with it. I think most people that would say they do have a problem with it are lying. So,
I think so. Everyone will tell you, or people will always tell you, like, you know, have your tape recorder out and have a pen and paper out. And those tools, I think, do work in a way to just signal to someone that you are recording what they're saying. I also try to talk to people about the jargon of journalism. Like, if there's stuff you don't want me to ask or you don't want to answer, you can tell me it's off the record. You can tell me it's on background. Like, it's such ridiculous language. They need to understand what that means. And then I think at the same time, it's such intimate reporting that there is this, like, great hypocrisy. It's like, on the one hand, I'm giving these people the tools to protect themselves from me. And on the other, I'm doing everything I can to draw them out and to be open and reflective. And so I think, like, my whole job, I find, is wrestling with these two different things at once. So I feel as if this person is protected and safe, but also with me and trusting me. And in a way, I agree with you that I understand that these people, many of them do ultimately become friends, and that, like, the process of reporting with them is kind of building a friendship. But I do want, while we're reporting, to have some distance.
Yeah. I mean, it's not a friendship in that, like, you're going to hang out with them and go out to, you know, like, go spend a weekend at the beach with them or something. I mean, it's not that kind of a friendship, but it's more of just like, you're a human being, you're a person with them.
Yes.
It's really, yeah, like, it's like you're not just a reporter, you're a human being, and if you can appeal to them as a person, I think they then can be a person back to you.
I think that's right. I think just being human. I mean, I have cried in many interviews talking to, for example, parents who've lost children, and, you know, I don't know what the official rules are about that, but that's not meant to be manipulative. That's not in violation of any rules in my book. It's just being a person listening to someone's story. and appreciating what they have to say and being present for them. And I think that's it. It's sort of like, how would you want to be treated if you were in this situation? And a lot of times I do grow close to people, and then we talk about, before I write, we talked about X, Y, and Z. How much of that are you comfortable with? Like, let's talk about what you're comfortable having in the story. In my most recent story for the Times Magazine and ProPublica, I interviewed 2 women who were sexually abused as one was 12, one was 16 at the time. And with the girl who was 12, who's now my age, I went over and over with her what she was comfortable having in the story and what not. And she was very prepared to have a lot of things in the story, but we went over it several times. I flew to Pensacola to read what I had written to her face to face. And, every couple of sentences I would look up and just say, what are your thoughts? Do you want me to say that differently? I felt so privileged that she had shared that story with me, and I wanted to tell it really carefully. And then I think after stories come out, I have maintained long friendships with certain sources, and they have become true friends. We've never gone to the beach, but we have, they have met my children. I mean, real friendships, because you've been through something really intense with them. That's more unusual than not, but that has happened.
I mean, I'm actually friends with the lawyer for this girl that wanted to join ISIS. Her lawyer, she's my age, where we became friends in the process, and she's actually in my book that I'm writing about her. She's a character, and she's a friend. And I have actually gone and spent the weekend at her house in Dallas. So, and met her children. And, but yeah, I mean, and it's, I think reading their quotes, reading stuff back to them, I do that too. There's always a voice in my head telling me you're not supposed to do that, though. I mean, that's one of those things that, again, it's like, when I went to a different J school. I went to Columbia, and when I went, that was a sin to do that. But it is reality.
But I also think it's different than you're interviewing the head of a corporation about whether his claim that X is. I mean, this woman did not need to tell me literally every detail of what happened to her when she was 12 that no one believed her about, and I think it would be irresponsible to, I could have, there's a fact checker who's going to call her, right? Who she's never talked to before, who's in Manhattan.
Right.
That just didn't feel right. Like, why not go over that with her first and then say, everything I'm saying to you, there's this person named X who's going to be calling you from the Times. They're going to go over all this, but you and I talk about it first.
I do that too, do that. And I let my editors, some editors have an issue with this idea, and I let them know, especially if they're young people, but if they're people that are, or if they're very sensitive sources, if they're like, when you're dealing with national security stuff, you have people that are not supposed to be talking to you, and are very worried about things like this. And I go over everything like that with them too. And because the fact-checking process can be very intimidating, especially at the Times. They'll spend hours. I mean, it's like insane. And so I go over everything with them, and basically I tell them, before, a lot of people are worried of will I be able to read this story before it comes out, which you can't do. So the next best thing is I will read you everything that I will go over every single thing that I'm going to write, and make sure you're comfortable with this before the fact checkers call you, and I'll explain the process to you so that they'll understand that.
Reading over your work, you feel a impulse, which I might term activism, that there is a real point to the work you're doing and the kinds of stories you choose to tell. Do you feel there's a tension between activism and journalism in your own work?
I don't see myself as an activist or an advocate. I certainly don't see myself as doing advocacy, except insofar as if I'm writing about kids in their late teens or 20s, I do not, I'm an advocate for them as young people who deserve to have a life, grow up and have a life. Just like I would if I was reading, writing about poor women or, but there's, that's an interesting question. I mean, sorry, I have like my sore throat, so I'm chewing on a cough drop. Rolling Stone had a reputation of being a polemical, I was not a polemicist. I'm not Matt Taibbi at all. I did not do that kind of writing. But we did have a point of view, which was like, basically what the government or the mainstream is telling you is potentially bullshit, and let us tell you the real story. And I believe that, I was just talking about this, to be honest with you, I was talking about this last night with my editor at the New York Times Magazine, who agrees with me that like one of the biggest problems with newspaper writing is that they take too much at face value. Our job as good reporters and as journalists is to take what is told to you, especially from official sources, and say, yeah, but I don't necessarily agree with you or believe that or agree with you. You cannot agree. And if you don't agree, then you pursue what it is that you believe. You believe you may have a very specific perspective on a story, and that's not necessarily activism as much as it is, I don't know what I would call it. It's not opinion. It's argument. It's analysis, I think. So I don't necessarily, like the Village Voice, which used to be down the street, they did act, their reporting was, in my view, it served an activist purpose. It served a purpose to elect somebody or to pass some legislation or to, I don't necessarily see that is what I do.
Yeah, I don't see myself as an activist either. But similarly, I do think that I make like a political commitment in my work. And the main thread that's a political commitment is that I'm centering the stories of people who are experiencing social policy. And that in and of itself is a political statement, which is like a disbelief of kind of an official narrative, or at least a questioning of it. Right. I think like, obviously my politics shape what I'm interested in and what I'm drawn to. And at the same time, I find often that my reporting shapes my political thinking. And that's actually when I know I've hit something really good. Because if it's challenging my assumptions, if it can challenge my assumptions, I feel like it might be something that's worthy of adding to like some kind of national debate.
Yeah, I guess what I worry about the word activist is that it sounds like maybe your facts aren't all correct. Right. And what I should have added to the story about the woman who was abused when she was 12 is, I had extensive police reports about what happened, and everything she told me and everything I told in the story matched up to a police report that was written in 1982. And so I think these are deeply, deeply reported fact-based stories that obviously have a perspective. And I think all of us are providing sort of a counter-narrative. Like right now you can turn on the TV and see 30 different shows about cops who are solving cases in 5 minutes with perfect DNA analysis, and prosecutors who are totally on the up and up. And that's sort of our narrative. And I feel like part of my job is to provide the counter narrative, which is fact-based and hopefully thought-provoking, and makes you think more deeply about the criminal justice system.
The kind of stories that you all three write are very emotionally challenging in the reporting, clearly, and in the kind of material you're dealing with. What were some of the stories that caused you the most challenging, and caused you the most anguish in your reporting? Janet, you could talk about your book.
All of them.
Every story is an agony for its own particular reason. Seriously, every story presents its own challenge, especially when you're somebody like, like as somebody who's a generalist, like to some degree, a big degree, I don't have a roster of lawyers and cop sources and people. Like, I don't have that. I don't have that Rolodex. So it's like, every story begins with terror, and and how much can I avoid doing without calling anybody? Because I'm very shy about. It's awkward. It's awkward making phone calls to strangers. It's hard. And visiting them and stuff like that. But I actually think the story that I wrote for the Times magazine most recently, which is this book I'm writing, was to some degree will incorporate, or is incorporated into this book, that was about how law enforcement dropped the ball on white supremacy when, the converse is that they spend an extraordinary amount of attention and time on this so-called Islamic terrorism, wrongly, frankly, in my view. But that was a very difficult story because that was about proving a negative. And I did not know how to do that, frankly. And it took me, it was one of the, I've been doing this for 20-something years, and God help me, and that was one of the first stories I'd done. I felt at times in that story like I did when I was 25 years old. And I was like, oh shit, this is gonna get killed. I failed. It was so hard. And I also had the experience of dealing with the FBI, which is one of the most opaque organizations frankly, I think in the world. It banks on you not knowing about it to build a myth around itself of invincibility that continues that empowers it. And it is very intimidating. I don't care who you are. It is incredibly intimidating to get calls from the FBI and say, who did you talk to for your story? Which is none of their business, and you don't have to answer that. And it's astonishing to be asked that question. But you're like, you're seriously, my first instinct is like that. Like, oh, did I screw up? So I think that, on a kind of, as a journalist, both structurally and kind of intellectually in a certain way, that was probably the most challenging. But I think that probably I've done a number of, the story about the ISIS kids in particular was probably one of the most gratifying stories I've done, but it was very, very hard because I am not Muslim, and dealing with the Muslim community who feel that they're under siege from the government, and also feel that they're under siege from reporters that don't understand them, and also feel very scared to tell you the truth because they don't know what's going to happen to them if they tell you the truth. They don't know who will knock on their door and say, well, maybe you'd make a good informant for us, and maybe we're going to threaten you until you decide to do that. There's a lot of stuff that happens. And gaining the trust of people in the Muslim community in the Chicago area is incredibly hard. It didn't always work, and it was immensely time-consuming, and I wound up, getting kicked out of lots of places, and that was, it was also a learning experience for me in cultural, in the kind of cultural reporting that you don't always, even when I've reported overseas a lot, you don't have that experience necessarily there, but this was really a closed world, and it was like, I'm sorry, but you're not welcome here, and that's it. And you have to make your peace with that and kind of understand, it gives you a sense of who you are, and I don't know, it was very difficult, so I guess I would say that one is the hardest.
I think for me, the story that is in this book, actually, that I wrote about an underground network of abortion providers was the hardest story I wrote for a number of reasons. One was that it took me a while even to weigh the morality of it. Is it worth it for me to write this story if it puts women at risk? What they were doing was illegal or legally murky in most states. And I had to decide for myself whether or not I thought that was a moral decision for me to make. And on top of that, I was working with a bunch of women who I think were trying to weigh it for themselves too. And so I generally tell sources, like, this only works if you're in it. Like, if you want to do this, that's the only way that this story is going to work. I didn't say that to these women, and I probably should have, but so they, throughout the reporting process, I think were weighing, is this worth it for me? Is this worth it for us? Or is this too much of a risk? And so I had to be a sounding board for them, and then also go back and forth in my own like moral compass at the same time. And that was really difficult. I nearly killed the piece once, and I nearly lost my main character another time. And that was 10 days before we were about to publish. She pulled out, and I said, "Can I take you to lunch?" And I got on a plane the next morning and flew out to meet her, and I took her to lunch, and I talked her back on board. But otherwise, the story would have been dead.
That's very stressful. I mean, I'm sorry to say they're all difficult. And I always feel that, I mean, there's so many different anxieties and pressures I feel, but the biggest one, honestly, is that people who've spent a lot of time with me and trusted me with a lot of information are going to be let down in some way. I'm going to get, I don't mean I'm going to get a fact wrong, but I'm going to say something in a way that's hurtful, or whatever they were hoping would come out of that experience isn't going to happen. Just by virtue of writing about criminal justice, a lot of this stuff is difficult. I wrote a story about a woman, this was 6 or 7 years ago, who was wrongly convicted, though she was in prison at the time, of killing one of her children. I was pregnant at the time that I reported it and went to prison to interview her about being separated from her 5 children, and that was one of the crying interviews. It was hard to remain totally separate from that subject, and had a, I don't want to say happy ending, this is a very difficult story, but she is now out, so, with her kids.
I mean, when you develop these close relationships and these sort of longitudinal relationships, you inevitably end up hurting people, offending them. I'm always amazed by the things that people are offended by. Someone saying you looked chubby, or this or that. Where you've written this glowing profile or something. I mean, you never can figure out the things that are ultimately going to really hurt people. At the end of these kinds of serious investigative pieces you do, a lot of people must be angry at you. Do you see that as a point of pride, something you just feel is part of the business you have to deal with? How do you deal with that?
Actually, the FBI thing it shook me up a little. It's weird. It shook me up a little. I kind of can't believe I'm admitting to this. And my colleagues and friends were like, "That's so cool. That should be your point of pride." So I guess it's a point of pride that I pissed off the FBI. And I was right. My facts are fine. So yeah, screw them. I've had death threats in some stories that I've done because it pisses people off. I'm not a very fearful person. I mean, it's weird. I'm not. I've have a long history of covering conflicts overseas, and so I've been in a lot of very scary situations. And a lot of times when I was a freelancer and I was like not, hoping for a story kind of thing, and didn't have anybody protecting me or paying for my bills really. So I think I've developed a bit of a thick skin over, about this. And I think, mostly though, I like you guys, I mean, I try to be as honest and as involved with the people I'm writing about. If I'm really, really writing about them, I'm on the phone with them, I'm texting with them, I'm constantly in touch with them, so that, we have established a basis of trust. And I think that, even if they are angry, I rarely will, in a story, in any one of the big stories I've done, I rarely anger the people whose stories I'm telling. It's usually that I anger the official bodies, the government, the police, something like that. I do not, the military, the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps hates me, and I was banned from coming to Iraq. I wrote a story. Can I tell the story? I wrote a story in like years ago during the Iraq War about. I was, you know, it was about the inanity of the Iraq War, and I was embedded with this army unit, and I wrote about how these guys were like, most of war is really boring until it's really scary, basically, and so they spent a lot of time, you know, when they weren't like terrified and doing horrible things, like, and you know, figuring out ways to cope with that, they would go online and like there used to be this site called Hot or Not, which is kind of pre-Tinder, and they would go and like check out girls, and they'd put pictures of themselves on and see how many likes they got. This was like mid-2000s. And this pissed off the colonel so much that he banned me, because he was trying to get promoted to general. And I had to plead with him, because I was supposed to come back. I was like, I am the only person who wants to come to Iraq at Christmas time. You know, like, how can you say no? And finally he said yes, but you know, but the guys liked it. They were happy, so you know.
I'm just going to jump in with, it kills me when I've done something that hurts somebody, especially someone who worked closely with me. And an example I'll just give you, this is back in my generalist days, I wrote a story about a rodeo queen competition, and it was about 4 teenage girls in this little town who were competing for the crown. It was the biggest thing going on in this town. 3 of the girls came from very established families. Their last names were well recognized in the town. And the 4th girl, I'll call her Jessica Smith, did not have the same kind of last name. And there was I think it was a quote. I don't think I said it in my words. I think it was a quote from her that said something like, you know, in this town, Smith is no kind of name. Story comes out, you know, everything's fact checked. Well, her estranged father called me Mr. Smith and was devastated, completely devastated, that in Texas Monthly, which is in every grocery store and Walmart across the state, that I had said this about his name. And it was, you know, just, before a story comes out, I'll lie in bed at night and just, oh my God, what have I not thought of? What have I not accounted for? What have I not done? And I think that's not an investigative story, but in investigative stories, and I don't want to talk about particular policies or particular stories on this, but I have done things called no surprises letters, where we'll send a very, very detailed letter to someone who you've written about critically in the story, to give them an opportunity to see all of that before the story is published. Often it's a person who hasn't responded to interview requests, and it can inspire quite an angry and spirited response.
But that's usually at the behest of a lawyer in that case, isn't it?
Not going to comment on that, but
I mean, just as a term of art, that's something that a lawyer says, okay.
Sure, but it's I'm amazed at what an incredible reporting tool it is, and how much information, after I have tried somebody for 6 months in every possible way and silence, and you send a letter like that, and you get a response more often than not. Sometimes it's off the record, sometimes it's on background, but it's invaluable. So there's that too.
That's what happened with that Scientology story I did for Rolling Stone, where we had tried to get their comment on a bunch of things, and we had tried to get them to give me access to various things that I'd want to have access to and people I'd want to have access to. And the fact checker sent them like a 3-page letter of all the various things I had said. And the next thing I know, I had a week-long trip, like a kind of a tour of every single thing I possibly might want, because they were so freaked out by not having a voice.
Well, they think you're going to go away. They think if they don't talk to you, will just go away.
It's crazy, and I've had to say this to, you know, I even with this, I just did a chapter in this book about a person who served in the Marine Corps in Iraq and is not talking to journalists, and I kind of understand why. And I've made it very clear to his family and to him, I am going to write about you. You are enough of a public figure that I know a lot about you, and I know a lot of people that know who you are. I am going to write about you. I do understand your experience. You know, I spent a year in the war in the exact same time. I am going to do this. So you have a choice to contribute back, or you can let this continue on. And so, you know, it sometimes works, and we'll see. But I think that's very important for people to understand, that, like, you're going to write about this. Like, you're going to figure out a way. unless, you know, you really reach a place where there's like no story without them, obviously. So
You can't tell them that.
can't tell them that, and by the way, that does sometimes happen. But yeah, I mean, and it's not really a threat. It's just like you're not gonna. You have a story. I'm gonna tell your story. You can help me tell your story, or you cannot be involved, and that's okay. And if you don't want to be involved, that's fine. But then you can't get angry because you didn't participate. And I think that, you know, I don't know. I think you have to undermine the people have a really negative view of reporters and journalists, and I think that if you are just straight with them and decent and you know, and just a human being, you really have to undermine. You have to get beyond their bias against you, because that's the biggest challenge right now. Particularly, it's a huge, especially with people that don't share our New York liberal perspective on the world. You know, like in Texas, it must be quite
A
difficult.
lot of fun singing with the New York Times.
I know,
Sure.
right? Yeah.
I think one of the things you're talking about, like upsetting larger institutions, and sometimes I find that I'm writing about characters almost as a stand-in for a larger institution, and then I piss them off, and then I feel awful because they just got unlucky. You know, like my last story was in Coffeyville, Kansas, and I was writing about a debt collector and a judge who together were sending medical debtors to jail. And they both were kind of like, why us? Like, why'd you come after us? And I don't have a good reason. Like, it could have been anyone. And so that, I think, in a way, that I feel guilty about it sometimes. You know, I have this judge who was very kind with me, very open with me, very reflective with me. His face is on the front of this thing. It's like about him sending medical debtors to jail. And unfortunately, sometimes I think that's part of our job. It doesn't get easier.
This is a wonderful collection. Again, I hope you will buy copies there at a discount. It features, I think, 20 women journalists, and we could certainly have done this panel 3-4 times over with fantastic women writers. The situation is very different from when I started in magazines. I think Janet was talking about this too. It was very much more of a boys' club. Although my first job was working for Clay Felker at Manhattan Ink magazine, and Clay was very actually solicitous of and very championed a lot of women writers. So I think that was a little bit less so. But I think it's fair to say the magazine world, New York magazine world, was fairly much of a boys' club. The terrain has transformed dramatically. The number of, you know, I don't want to say young, but, you know, middle-aged, young, whatever, but the number of women writers, very high-profile magazines, very high-profile stories, not being shunted to doing sort of women's things or lifestyle stuff the way might have gotten done in the past. There's been this real change in the landscape. I guess I have two questions. Why do you think that is? And I know that some people have some thoughts about the quality of women's writing and men's writing today.
Janet has a big opinion about this.
Was I subtle enough in that?
I hope you were. I will invite plenty of hate mail. I believe that the vast majority of great writing, magazine writing, and books too, at this point in time, is in terms of people who are writing right now, not people who have been writing for 40 years, is female, and which is so gratifying to me because I am somebody who I did not, you know, I worked for a men's magazine, Rolling Stone magazine. We had plenty of women who covered other things. I was the only woman who was able to cover anything I wanted and was kind of a serious reporter. And had plenty of opportunities, but I was a token, very conscious. I was aware of that. I was, you know, I checked a number of boxes that I needed to check, which is a kind of a different conversation. But I mean that you know, there used to be in a lot of magazines, particularly men's magazines, there you know, a certain type of girl who would get a lot of opportunities, and she was, you know, she would yell at her boss in the middle of the hallway and be like, you know, and very confident, and had kind of you had to learn to be that person in a strange way. And I don't see that now. I see there are plenty of women who are just who they are, and who are doing amazing work and are true to their own selves and are appreciated for that. And I find that amazing. And I think that I am not sure why it is in some ways, because I certainly did not have any mentors, and Pam and I have talked about this. I had no female mentors. I only had male mentors. And I did not get the opportunities that, in the way it used to be, and I think to some degree it continues to be, is that if you're a young guy, and you're a young, hungry guy, right? You're a young, hungry, young male reporter. You've just gotten out of grad school, or you've just, gotten out of college, and you're just like, you want to go do a story, and you're going to have a male editor who's going to give you a shot, and you're going to suck. Your story is going to suck. You don't know how to write a magazine story. And that guy is going to help you and help you shape it because he sees something in you. You could be the next, like Mike Sager. You could be the next Mike Sager, right? Like, that didn't happen to me. I had an editor who would say to me, I'm going to give you the shot. I see something in you. And I'd screw it up, and they'd be like, sorry. You should keep trying, keep going, but we can't hire you. And that would happen. That happened for 10 years. So I don't think that's happening as much anymore. I think there's a tremendous guilt in the business around that you can't do that. You have to actually help young people, no matter whether they're male or female. And so I think that's one reason. And then I also think that
men's magazines have also died.
And men's magazines, that's true too.
Sorry,
All the magazines,
fact.
yes. And actually, the magazines that we work for at the time, like I'm the biggest booster of the New York Times Magazine. I love the New York Times Magazine, and they have always been open to women, and they have always had women editors, and it's been a much more inclusive place. They've always had women reporters. It's a very, very different, oh my God, it's such a different vibe there than it like any other magazine I've ever worked for or tried to work for. So, I also think financially there are a number of men who just decided this was not a financially profitable business for them. They decided to go off and start their own, like The Activist, was started by a journalist, or they started their own podcasting company, lots of journalists, and or they've taken off into very aggressive investigative reporting, political investigative reporting jobs that are not magazine, not big feature jobs, because the values of our country now and a journalistic environment has been turning towards a kind of like scoop-based, news-based, hot take-based, opinion-based writing. And that's not what we do. So I think there's been more opportunity, but I also think that the kinds of stuff that we do lends itself to who we are. We like, women are great storytellers, women like people. Women have been trained to be patient. Women have been trained to be nice and to be gracious. And that all of these are really, really good skills in this kind of journalism. We're not assholes by nature. And not that men are, but like we don't get it. We can't get away. We were never told you can't get away with being an asshole, right? As a girl, like you have to be nice, or used to have to be nice. And those skills are, I think, really important. So anyway. Sorry, I feel like I've offended everybody by making this comment.
I was just going to say, I think, there's a lot that makes me sad about the death of these magazines. I didn't mean to be funny, but the death of men's magazines, music magazines, and sports magazines. Those were the three entry points for me and Janet.
Yes.
So think about who those magazines favor in terms of sensibility. And that's largely gone.
And also, the women's magazines have to some degree declined, but our entry point could not be through those women's magazines if we wanted to have the careers that we had.
That was the kiss of death, was to write for a women's magazine, but to write for a men's magazine, then you were in. So that's changed a lot, and they're real mentors now. I had one female mentor who was Mimi Schwartz, who was amazing. I also worked for really, really wonderful, supportive men. I was really lucky at Texas Monthly with several different people mentoring me over the years. But I think what I remembered when I got pregnant with my first child, I went through this period of mourning because all I knew, aside from Mimi, was you were this hard-hitting, amazing female reporter, and then you had a child and you wrote essays. And you wrote essays about your kids, and you wrote essays about, I don't know. I couldn't read them. I couldn't get through them. And I thought, well, I guess that's my fate. I have nothing to say in an essay form, but I will have a baby and I will become that person.
That person, somehow I'll figure out a way to write about
it was
something.
such a relief after having my first child and then my second child. Oh, I can still do this, and more people are doing this. And I remember even in recent years being so surprised, not anymore, at women journalists talking about their children on Twitter. I always thought that was something I had to hide, never talk about, because maybe I wouldn't get an assignment, or maybe I wouldn't be seen as serious enough, or maybe I don't do stories in Iraq, but maybe I wouldn't get sent to Iraq, whatever that story would be. And so things have changed so fast, and I'm really happy about it.
I had a friend who went to Iraq pregnant, and she was, not only was she was attacked in print. People wrote about the fact that she had gone to Iraq pregnant, and how dare she? She put the troops all had to, when you do an embed, you become their main priority. You can't die on them, and so they need to protect you, and it's always very stressful. A lot of the troops are very, very religious, so they were protecting her and the life of her child, and she was like 6 months pregnant. And, it became a huge fuss that she, and I was like, it was so bizarre. Like, it became a scandal that she went and did her job. I think she was 5 months pregnant. So, that's the kind of thing that, like, I hope it would not. That was about 7 or 8 years ago. I hope that wouldn't happen. Or 10 years ago. And I hope that wouldn't happen now.
I have always felt immensely lucky to start my career at a time when I admired so many female journalists. And in a way, it's no surprise to me. Like, we all do stories that are focused on getting inside the minds of our characters.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, as Janet was saying, like, women are expected to do so much emotional labor that in no way was it ever surprising to me at the start of my career that so many of my favorite writers did the kind of work I wanted to do. And sorry, so many of my favorite writers were women who did the work that I wanted to do.
Yeah, I just think it's a, I really hope that this form, we talk a lot about what to call this, I consider myself a feature writer, I guess. The other thing about what this involves is that it's incredibly difficult, and you need good editors, which is not necessarily, it's part of the death of the magazine business, is the death, the professional death of people that really know how to make a story great. I had wonderful editors, Rolling Stone male editors, fantastic editors. My editor was fired. A lot of the best editors have left these jobs. So, I think it's a really huge challenge right now, just in terms of keeping this kind of form going and nurturing a new generation of talent. But I do think that, like, you're a great example. But there are a number of young women like you. I'm like excited for you. It's great for you. I hope you don't suffer at all. But you've been, it's amazing. It's hard. It's very hard to do what we do, and I've, like, I'm sure Pam has too. Like, I do try to really help mentor younger women, and if any girl that I've ever worked with in any capacity calls me up and asks me to have dinner or lunch with her, I will absolutely do it. I give lots of professional advice because I didn't have that, and it's really, I think I would have loved it. It would have been so comforting. It would have given me so much confidence, and I didn't have that. And it had there was no sexual harassment in there. There was no component there was no quid pro quo in that arrangement. It was just like actually help. And so I really try to give that as much as possible, because I also believe that the only way that women will, that this will never, I have an issue with, like, we're just really good journalists, we just happen to be female, but we're really good at what we do. We've been doing it a long time, and the only, the only way that this will continue is if women help each other in the same way that men have always helped each other. So, you know.
I'd like to throw it open. I'm sure people have lots of questions. So, yes, you in purple. Oh, there's a microphone around. So sorry. Yes.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thank you all so much for doing this. It's really fascinating. I'm just curious, and you somewhat touched on it, but a lot of your long-form investigative work touches on communities that are historically disenfranchised, thought of as the least of us, people of color, people that have been historically targeted. How do you come in with your identity being just bluntly cis women, from what we can see, what I can see, this is only my perspective, who are white and you're trying to gain trust from communities that have been historically disenfranchised. What does that trust building exercise look like? But also, how do you voice issues from communities that you're not from fairly, and how do you mindfully gather that?
Is it anyone? So this has become more of a problem in the recent years, first of all. Again, I am somebody who believes that I'm a good person and I am truthful. And I tend to believe, I mean, this may sound idealistic and dumb, but like I tend to truly and naive believe that people respond to decency and honesty no matter what race you are and what gender, and you know, if you come at somebody honestly and say, look, I want to tell your story and I'm open to your experience and I don't know very much about you actually. Like I'm clearly, you know, like like for example, I'm Jewish, right? So I'm writing, I'm a sort of secular, but I'm Jewish. I'm not going to deny it. I'm writing about white supremacists, you know? I'm like, look, I'm a Jew, so go ahead and hate me if you'd like to, but I actually want to understand, like, why do you believe what you believe? I've had long conversations with people about, you know, their beliefs, where they try to convert me, you know, to their beliefs, or, you know, I mean, I think if you are, it's not about you. This isn't about you. It's not about me. I'm not, you know, these things make me really uncomfortable, actually, because it's not about me. I'm never in my own stories. It's about everybody else. So I try to not think about myself. And I hope that will, and I truly believe that other people respond to that if they understand that this isn't about you. You're not there to make money. You're not going to make money. You're not there to, you know, to become famous. You're not there to, you know, do all these things. You're there to tell their story, honestly. I think they respond to that, but I do think it's becoming more and more challenging. I think it's becoming extremely politicized. Who has the right to tell this story? And I don't have, I mean, I am somebody who never had to consider that question, to be 100% truthful with you, and it's uncomfortable for me to have to think about whether or not I have the right to tell a story like that, but I think, I don't know. I mean, but that you guys have had a lot of experience with this too, so.
Well, I think I'm certain I've made mistakes. I think about that a lot. I think about a lot of stories in retrospect. How might I have done them differently? I think obviously diversifying our newsrooms is look at this panel. We've come a long way and yet we haven't, right? So I think there's still a ton of work to do, and that's something that I know we're deeply involved in, as imperfect as it may be. I think also diversity, when I think about covering criminal justice, a good friend of mine is Carrie Blakinger, who was at the Houston Chronicle. She just went to the Marshall Project. Carrie is formerly incarcerated. She has a incredible personal story. She's writing a memoir right now about that. And I have learned so much from watching how Carrie covers the criminal justice system. I talk to her almost every day. I frequently check in with her about phrasing, about how to approach someone about something. In my last story, I had to use the word inmate a number of times for reasons which I usually try to avoid. And I talked through with her the use of that language. She helped me with some public record requests, that things I would never have thought to ask for. And the Marshall Project has been amazing at trying to integrate people who are formerly incarcerated into their reporting staff. And so I think for each beat, not only do we need more racial, ethnic, so many different kinds of diversity, but we need experience diversity also. And I think that that's a good beginning. And I think we can try to be as conscious of our limitations as possible. And that sort of thing where I talked about having someone be a part of the storytelling. How do you want your story told? Are these the right words? Help me tell the story. I think is really important. It's not perfect, but it's important.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think I always come into stories terrified I'm going to get them wrong, regardless of who I'm reporting on. Once I leave, I'm from here. Once I leave here, we're honestly in a different country as far as I'm concerned. And I feel like it's my responsibility to do everything in my power to be a great listener, to do a lot of research around a topic that I'm working on so that I feel well-versed, like not just in the experiences of the people I'm writing about, but like in the scholarship around it, in the art around it. I think it takes enormous responsibility to report on people and communities that are not your own. And every single time, I think that's like a burden that, is like a privilege often to take on in some ways.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
All of you were really open about talking about how you've been fortunate when it comes to resources and funding, especially for this kind of long-form work, and how that can be difficult, especially for people who are freelancing or independent and don't have access to this. So I'd really like to hear about when limitations, whether it be to documents or to time, or especially with criminal justice and health, in terms of access to like people not just in power, but people who were really at the center of the story, and how you overcame a really crucial challenge that was central to a story that you were working on. Because if you can't address sort of like how you get around the money thing or the resource and time thing, like there's still deadlines, but I'd really love to hear how you overcame other kinds of challenges, especially with this kind of work.
I want Lizzie to talk about funding because she's the master of funding, but I'll just say with criminal justice specifically, I have more resources now in this current job, but before this, I was the master, I think, of just talking to every lawyer I could to try to get documents from them.
Oh, yeah.
Even if they didn't want to give them to me, because as everyone knows, things like PACER and trial transcripts are cost prohibitive to almost everyone. And just trying to work those relationships in any way possible and really having them understand why it was so important, why having those particular documents, like I could not tell the story without them. And if they wanted to leave them out on their desk and then go to the bathroom while I took pictures of things with my phone and they never made copies of things for me, that was okay.
Yeah, same thing.
There was a lot of that. But anyway, that's just one thing. But
yeah, so I started off freelancing, and there are some amazing organizations that will fund you. And I would encourage everyone who's doing this work to apply to them, because I think that they're all kind of dying to work with really passionate.
Could you name a few of them?
Yes, I can. So Type Investigates is one, which I mentioned before. They're so wonderful. I love them. There's the International Women's Media Foundation, IWMF. They also do fantastic stuff. There's the Fund for Investigative Journalism. There's the Pulitzer Crisis Center. Like all four of those places have a lot of money.
And the DART Foundation.
And the DART Foundation,
The
yep.
DART Foundation.
And there are people behind those names, and if you apply, those people might say, hey, we didn't love this, it doesn't work for us this time, but what else do you have? And so you can start a rapport with the people who are giving out that money. And that launched my career, like just point blank. I couldn't have done this the way I did without that kind of support. And it was not just financial support, but it was editorial support, which was huge. I mean, there were people who were teaching me how to investigate, and they weren't my like story editors. So I would highly recommend looking into those funds.
I think that's true. That's true. I'm trying to think. What was I mean, the money thing. I just had so many money problems when I was starting out. I was a freelancer. I lived on kill fees, and which used to be fairly substantial. Magazine writing used to pay a lot more. So if you have a story killed, like it was actually a couple $1,000s or something, and you know, it was that would somehow manage to cover some part of my rent or whatnot. But like, I mean, I was a broke freelancer for a long time, and I did have, you know, look, I had family support. I mean, I think one of the biggest problems, like to get back to this issue of diversity, is that, you know, it's an incredibly, like people who write for magazines are generally incredibly privileged because you don't get paid as much. And in fact, the better magazines that you work for, the least you get paid. So the New Yorker, you know, they don't pay very much. The Times magazine doesn't pay it that much. You know, it's some of the lesser magazines that are trade magazines, for example, pay way better. Who wants to write for them necessarily, right? But like they do pay well. And so like if you have any kinds of financial constraints, whether you're white or Latino or black or something else, you know, it is prohibitive to think of yourself as like trying and failing for 5 years, writing for, you know, trying to write a big story for Rolling Stone or for any of these magazines. How are you going to survive without mom or dad or somebody in your life or your husband or your wife or somebody helping? And so that's a reality, and I don't think we always discuss this enough, but like, you know, we're fortunate. I'm incredibly fortunate. You know, I had a lovely and wonderful father, 100%, you know, thank you, Daddy, frankly, right? And I'm like, I'm not ashamed of that, but that's the truth. So these organizations are a godsend to journalism. They're a godsend. I don't deserve that, by the way. Like, I would never apply for one of those because it's not for me. It's for somebody who really needs that, and, you know, somebody who doesn't have that money and doesn't have, you know, it doesn't have all the connections. They're, you know, they're made for somebody who's 27, 26, 25, you know, just starting out. No one's going to give you a chance. Or you don't have any money and you really need the money. But even with that, you know, I had a fellowship in, so in 2000, I had what used to be called the Pew Fellowship for International Reporting, is now called the International Reporting Project. And international journalism used to be something that, like, it was incredibly hard to do if you were younger, because all these like baby boomers took those jobs, and they did not want to give you, they were always the ones who were getting those assignments. And then the wars came around, and nobody wanted, these people who had kids and families, they didn't want to do that. So all of a sudden you started seeing a lot of 27-year-olds who were covering Iraq, and they were the bureau chief for the Washington Post, frankly. But before that, before say 2003, it was very difficult if you wanted to cover any kind of crisis to get funding from anyone, any magazine, didn't matter how much they liked you. And so that was an amazing organization, and that's another one that I would highly, highly recommend if anybody has an interest in I mean, when I was in journalism school, I had people that would come to speak to my class who would say, just go off for, like, you know, you want to do this, go put yourself down somewhere. Like Tina Brown used to say that, go put yourself down, like go to India. Go to India, okay. First of all, I have to pay to get there. Second of all, I have to live somewhere where I'm not going to get raped, killed, or sick. You know, third, I'm going to have to find a story in a country that's like 5 times the size of my own, which is already 5, you know, I mean, go put yourself down somewhere. So, I mean, there are organizations that will help you figure out your story, work with you. This International Reporting Project is connected to Johns Hopkins, and you have to spend a few months going to classes, and they have seminars, and they help you figure out your stories, and they give you a lot of financial support, and it's really amazing.
Did someone say it shut down?
Did it shut down? Did it really? Oh no. Oh, maybe it did. Well, for years and years. But, you know, but the Pulitzer Center has helped. You know, there have been, you know, there are new groups that have come into, you know, to sort of step into that gap. But I think there's there's a very clear understanding in the larger world of journalism that this needs to be done. And I don't know, can I make one more comment about this? Like the biggest issue, if you want to understand why funding is so important and why we need to be attentive, is if you look at like Syria, the number of journalists who were killed in Syria, they were freelancers who had no funding. They had no financial support from their organizations. Even if they were freelancing or stringing for their organizations, they were not given that support. And so they had to take tremendous risk. And journalists who had covered conflicts in the past, it was appalling to see the kinds of risks that they were allowed to take without the support from their institutions. And it wound up getting 3 or 4 of them killed. It's very dangerous, and you really have to, I think it's really important for people to impress upon, these institutions, whether they're nonprofits, whether they're big newspapers, whether they're big magazines, that this stuff, it costs money, and you have to fund it if you want it to be quality. So.
Yes, sir. You get the microphone.
Oh, hi. At some various points, you guys have alluded to write-arounds, whether it be for a chapter of a book or a story. And I was wondering if you'd ever been in a situation where the subject of the story or the chapter wasn't talking to you, and like halfway through you just prayed that they wouldn't, because it would have messed up the dynamic of the story.
I did an interview Jahar Tsarnaev, who was, of course, in prison. I actually am having that experience right now. I'm doing this right now. I've just finished writing about a person who I decided I wanted to convey something about him. I'm also writing a book. Books are different, right? They're a little bit different. You can be a little bit more creative. I wanted to convey something about his story that was a bit more universal than just about him. And I drew from my own understanding of an issue and of a place, and I think if he agreed to sit down and talk to me, he might screw it up. So that's actually something that is happening right now with a character who is in the military as a soldier with post-traumatic stress syndrome.
I'm so curious what this refers to within your own
yeah,
book,
really.
which I have
do
a
you
copy
have
of,
something? Exactly.
and now I'll be reading it with this in mind. I think the only time I felt that is when I was really close to publishing a story, and I was terrified I would have to rip it up. But I think normally the opposite. It kills me when someone won't talk, and it like gnaws at me. What do I not know?
Yeah. That's generally it's really unusual to do big write-arounds, like, unless you're doing a celebrity. Some people do celebrity write-arounds, but those are always supposed to be creative. Like, you all learn them, like Frank Sinatra had a cold story and all those kinds of classic journalism, pieces of journalism that were all write-arounds, and they're more like exercises in literary writing than they are in actual reporting. What? It's still a write-around.
No, Talese tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't.
He wouldn't talk to
get
him.
any time. He's.
Told me that towards the end of the story, Sinatra agreed to talk.
Oh, did he?
I hadn't heard that.
I had never heard that either. Okay.
Interesting.
You know more than we do.
Yes. Yes.
What do you do when someone gives you information that you know is going to get them into serious legal trouble? What do you do with the information or to protect them? Yeah, I guess the abortion clinic story is what made me think of this.
Yeah.
How did you work that out? Because as I was rereading that the other night, I was thinking about that, how much they were really, as she got deeper and deeper into this whole network, and it got larger and larger, it seemed like the stakes were getting higher and higher. How did you avoid that?
If you notice in the story, I don't name a single state in the story. So it can take place anywhere in the United States. And that was something that we agreed upon very early on, that I could describe landscape, but I could do nothing that was geographically isolating. So we agreed early on to a number of parameters, but obviously those things had to shift, because some people would tell me details about their lives that I didn't even realize as they were telling me could be could make them identifiable. And so it was only in this kind of no surprises for some of them situation where I was going through it, I was saying where some people would freak out, like, you cannot say my profession, like that will signal something. And so I would lay awake at night, like just terrified that some tiny detail was going to give someone away. I did a lot of talking with the subjects about their legal risk. I consulted not just the lawyer for the magazine I was writing for, but friends who were lawyers and lawyers who were friends of friends, just to understand the landscape, because I didn't just want a media perspective for them, I also wanted them to understand what a criminal lawyer would say. So I gave them a lot of legal information about their own risks, and we talked through a lot of it. I also, at a certain point, had to say to them, if I were subpoenaed, what I would do. And so I had to talk through that and where I stood. But I think that open conversation really helps a lot of people. She had a long-standing agreement with her partner that she would never feature, even anonymously, in a story about this work, partly for reasons pertaining to his situation. And when I started the article, she told me, no way will I be in it. And my editor at the time said, just work with it and see what you can do. And halfway through, I said to her, can I just try? I spent 5 days with her, and I have 20 hours of tape with her. And I said at some point, can I just try to write you in, and you can tell me at the end what you think. I wasn't going to read it back to her, but I would paraphrase it. And she said, okay to that. And so I did that, and I moved forward. And then it was 10 days before we were going to publish that this happened. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes.
Wouldn't do it again.
So you mentioned that you flew out there and you went to lunch with her. I'm sure it was a long conversation, but what did you say to sort of get her back into the story? I'm so curious.
Oh, God, if only I could remember. I remember the drive up there being like, I better pull this off. I know what I said. So I had two main characters in the story. One was a woman who was providing abortions, and I was following her. And one was a woman who had helped to orchestrate the network. And she was that woman who almost pulled out. And I explained to her that if I took her out, the story would fail. And not in a storytelling way, but in a political way, in a sense. That the last thing I wanted to do was write another story about a rogue abortion provider who was doing this work at home. And that what was really important actually was all of the care and the attention that they had put into building a network that operated safely and with a lot of thought and a lot of research. They were using mainly abortion pills, which around the world is quite safe to use at home, and you don't need to take in a doctor's office. So what I was trying to explain to her is that if I took her out of the story, I would write the exact opposite of a story that she believed in, and I needed her.
So this is an instance of me asking a question that has come up in my own work, which is, it kind of relates back to, forging emotional connections with your sources over long periods of time. How do each of you handle when a source dies in terms of the connections that you've made or information you haven't been able to glean? What is that like?
I have not. That's tough, man. I've had a couple people die. I fortunately have not had a lot of sources die, especially not when I'm working on a story with them. It's hard. I mean, it's very. I haven't. I mean, but I honestly, like, I've known people that have gotten killed essentially in wars, but they have not been like the subject of the story. If they were the subject of the story, that would be part of the story, obviously. So, I think for me, it's just death is, especially if they're younger, it's terrible and tragic, and it's just like it would feel with anybody that you knew, that was a friend, that was somebody that you spent time with. But yeah.
I've
haven't either, but I'm
kind of curious what your experience is.
I think
Because that sucks, right? That must be terrible.
Well, this is what happens when you write stories of the mid-century. It really becomes almost like a chase between.
Oh yeah.
You're trying to find people before they shuffle off to the mortal coil
If
because
they're old,
yeah.
they're old, right?
So it really is. I say that I'm essentially working at the edge of memory and firsthand experience, and I want to try to reach them as much as I can, knowing that it's probably the last time they will have a meaningful conversation about a subject that perhaps they have never discussed with anyone with me.
But that must be so gratifying and therapeutic for them. I mean, that must be amazing for them.
In one instance, yes. In a couple of instances, it depended. And I'm facing it right now.
Is there something that just made me think of is having written a number of stories set in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, is that the people are alive, but their memories are extremely unreliable and or fading and or when I catch them on different days, I get different things. And what to do with that? And I don't have a good answer for that. That's almost every story now. It's really, I'd love to talk about it more.
Yeah, that's tough. That's like, although I do find that older people, really older people, their memories of last week are terrible, but their memories of like 40 years ago. My dad told me, my dad passed away a few years ago. He was like 92. He told me stories about the 1950s and 40s that I'd never heard before. And all of a sudden it's amazing. They have this incredible recall, and it's like, I think oral histories are so fascinating of people who are in their 80s and 90s, because there's something that goes on actually biologically in the brain where you can really conjure up something that may have happened to you when you were in your 20s, but you will not remember what happened, last month.
But I'll just add with what Sarah and I do. You often have records from that time, and you're asking someone, and they're giving you very convincing, persuasive description of it that does not match the records, and you have to figure out where the truth lies.
That's true too. Yes.
We have room for time for about 2 more questions. Yes. Maybe wait just a second, so Megan can give you the mic.
So when a source tells you something shocking or horrifying or something that like that's my hook, like that's what I'm going to go with, how have you honed your poker face in terms of not looking shocked, not looking judgmental, not getting too excited, like both in terms of how you look and like what you say, that you keep it measured and keep them talking?
That's always when I write in my notebook. And sometimes it's just right. Holy shit. Yeah. But I'm, and just like ask the blandest next question, and then circle back to it later. But that's almost every story that someone says something that inside I'm like, oh my God. It's easier on the phone, of course, but.
It's always when I check to make sure that I used to bring 2 recording devices to interviews that were important because I knew that something, just in case one broke, and I could have 50 in the room and I'd still be like, oh my God, like making sure it's still working. Is this still working? Which actually happened to me during an interview recently where all of a sudden my iPhone somehow stopped, like the recording just stopped, and I missed something. And I had to go back and, I missed 45 minutes, which were very crucial 45 minutes, and I had to go back and ask them these questions. It's like, I don't know if you have this, but I almost have like, it's such a shocking experience, and I almost have like selective memory loss. I kind of don't remember, because it's usually such a like, and it happens in almost every single story that I do.
I'm actually worried it's turned me into sort of like a sociopath, because in real life, if someone tells me something horrible, I'll be like. Like I have a guy that I wrote about who died actually, but he died before
did the story, part of the reasons I was doing the story is because this character had died. And yeah, his parents would tell me stuff that was really unbelievable and made me mad, actually. And so one of the things I had to do was not show that I was so appalled, which was very hard. Because sometimes you're appalled. Sometimes you're appalled at. I think it's really challenging, especially if you're coming from like where I'm coming from, because I'm also from here, to talk to people who are parenting their children or coming out the world in a way that just makes no sense to you and is morally wrong to you. And sometimes, how do you? And you have to somehow put that aside and remember that you're not telling your own story, you're telling their story, and so you just have to somehow like suppress that. And it does kind of, sometimes you do feel like you turn into a sociopath. Like sort of nothing phases me anymore. I'm like, yeah, whatever. Like nothing shocks me at this point because I've kind of heard it all.
All right, last question. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you so much. First of all, on IRP did shut down. They lost their funder, but they got sort of, IRP, the funder lost their funder. And then they sort of got absorbed into New America, which is another source
That's
of
it,
money.
right, exactly. That's what happened.
My question is, when you're working on these massive investigations and you have all sorts of strands going, what are some ways that you keep all of your reporting organized?
Wow.
Let's let Lizzie tackle that one.
I don't. I mean, I do a very bad job of it. I wish I did a much better job of it. I record a lot and I keep copious notebooks, and then I come home and I transcribe, and it is hell. And then I read through everything I've transcribed, and that's hundreds of pages. And I go through it and I try to organize strands from the transcriptions, and I do it with color-coded Post-it notes. And then I weave them on a wall and make a structure out of it. So that's my personal way of working. But it's hell. But I think everyone's way is hell.
It's really hellish. Transcribing is really awful, and I got at a certain point when I was working at Rolling Stone, they said to me, "Oh, we can have somebody do that for you," and I have not transcribed since, and I actually regret it because it was really helpful to my understanding of the story, but it's hell. It's unbelievable. So I've sometimes used people to transcribe for me. I mean, organizing a big project like a book is a nightmare. And I've discovered, so crazily enough, because I had this kid that was transcribing for me, who then who did stuff on OneDrive or something, like the Microsoft Word. So, and other people I know do things on Google Drive, and so I just like kind of discovered that so you can save your documents like in the cloud, so I don't have to have them anywhere. Like they can just, so in case my computer dies, it's up there. So I then began to organize my notes and my drafts in 2 different cloud, sometimes 3. So they're all over the place, and I don't know whether they're in like the iCloud thing, the Apple Drive, or like it's a nightmare.
Amazon has all of them.
Yeah. Right, Amazon, right, they have all of them. And I'm not a structure person. Like I'm not an outline. I'm an outline person, but I'm not a diagram person. But I wish I was, because I think that's actually a great way to do it. I will go through I color code instead of Post-its, I color code the text. So I give characters different colors. I highlight. Same thing. Like I will highlight. Sometimes I also print everything out. Because I find that reading something on the page you're going to absorb it better, and sometimes it's just easier. And so I'll go through documents and I'll highlight different issues in different colors, and that'll help me get to them faster.
I don't do any of those things. I'll try to say this succinctly, but I have one master document that I put everything in. Not transcripts, but I just came back from an interview and here's what stood out to me. And I just keep adding to it, and as I add to it, there start to become logical groupings that things have thematically or chronologically. and then that leads me to an outline. But I don't print anything out. I have links to audio. Everything's digitized. And I actually, well, it's because I live 2,000 miles away from my fact checkers. So I had to, but it's so much easier because I don't have to go rifling through stuff. It's all in one. I can word search one document. This sounds much more organized and smart than it actually is in reality. But I used to record everything. I used to transcribe everything. I ended up finding that it took up enormous amounts of writing time, which is what I need. And I started becoming much more selective. I love phone interviews for the reason that I can write down the time signature of something that stuck out to me. I mean, I'll scribble it down, but alongside that, the time signature, so I can go back. And I used to have the luxury of interns who transcribed for me. I don't anymore, and I'm actually grateful for that, because when I do the transcribing myself, which I now have to do, I have to be much more thoughtful about what I'm recording. And I relive the interview, and I remember, oh yeah, there was that moment when he said, which on the page doesn't always register, but when you hear it, it does. And so a lot of it's just time management, trying not to end up with 40 hours of tape, because that means less writing for me.
And also, you don't have to transcribe everything, but I can't, like, as somebody who has had interns do transcribing and who kind of got lazy, I cannot emphasize enough how not record. I mean, it was something I actually learned. Like, I learned this when I was in journalism school, to not bring a recorder to an interview. I'm a terrible note taker. This is very lazy. It's a very lazy way of doing it. And transcribing your own interviews especially if you're writing kind of magazine stories or a book. I mean, it's everything, because when you're interviewing somebody, first of all, you're getting the scene, all kinds of connections are coming into your head. I mean, there's the tone of a person's voice, like all these things that do not appear in a transcript. So I find, like, what's even a bigger time suck is they will transcribe it for you, and you still have to go back and listen in order to get that. It's so, I mean, if you get in the habit of doing your own transcribing and just finding a way to suck it up, it will benefit you in your career so much, really.
You had a question you wanted to ask. Yeah. Yes.
I'm pretty loud.
I like you already.
So if you can identify it, at what points in your careers did you start to feel like you really got an understanding of, or a grasp of, or command of your voice? How long had you been writing for? What did you do to develop it and nurture it? What role did editors play? Are you still searching for it? I know at a few points tonight you had said, like, I was a generalist, or I am a generalist. So,
like your writing voice, you mean, or your?
Yeah, like your writing voice and your storytelling.
So, and if you're writing a book, you're allowed to have a voice that you're not allowed to have if you're writing for magazines. Have their own voice. So, and newspapers do too. And so no matter what your voice is, it may not be the voice of your article. So, so when you are writing, I mean, because there's always a house style of some sort that will kind of tone you down or cut your I write really long sentences. Those sentences will be cut down in magazines. I think I struggle with every story, every single story. And every chapter I write, everything I do, every time, it's a nightmare. It's horrible. Writing sucks. It's hard. It's really hard, and it's really and you're plagued with self-doubt, constantly. You always have a voice in your head telling you, oh, that's not right, or that doesn't sound good, or that maybe you should. I read a lot of other people. Sometimes I look at other models of articles that are kind of similar, or writers who are writing things that maybe not the same topic, but like stylistically, who I like, and I study the form, so I understand how it's done. But like, I don't know if I think it took me 10 or 15 years to figure out how to write a magazine. It took me 10 years to figure out how to write a magazine story. It took me maybe another 5 years, 6, 7 years to figure out how to do it okay, do it well. I still think I'm terrible. I mean, that's reality, you know, I mean, that's, I'm a perfectionist. So I don't know. I don't know how you guys feel, but I think I never, I'm satisfied and feel like I've done it.
I think it's a great question. I think a lot about voice, and for me it was imitation for so long. I would inhale whatever writer I was obsessed with. I would, that's what I did print out. I would print out other people's stories and I would highlight it and I would study their sentence structure, and I would try to write a first section, like if I were David Gran, how would I write this first section? And it never worked, but then maybe it helped lead me to what I thought I should write. I also worked for 20 years for Texas Monthly that had a very particular voice, and I had to go through the process of learning how to do that voice by studying old issues and then unlearning it when I left that job. And trying to figure out whatever it is I'm doing now. So it's something I still, I think about every day, and it's always changing.
Yeah, I've never once thought I have found my voice. But I think that I did a lot of what Pam did by reading other people's stuff and highlighting it. Not just magazine stuff, I do that a lot with novels. So even as I was like sitting at my desk trying to write, I'd have a stack of 5 or 6 novels. And when I felt bored with my sentence structure, so I'd flip them open and start seeing how people wrote. So I did a lot of imitation at first. I do sometimes still, but less. I think, though, for me, I'm often trying to write from the perspective of my characters. And so that's one reason why I love recording, because I sometimes try to mimic their language and their cadence and how they would describe their experiences. And in a way, I think that takes the pressure off of me to think, like, what is my voice? And allows me to think very carefully around, like, how would these people, what language would they use and why? Yeah.
Listen, thank you very much for coming. Again, books are for sale here. Good night.